Hey folks, we've got another treat for all you roguelite fans today, since the folks over at Studio Fizbin recently reached out to shoot me a review key for ReignBreaker, a title which feels a bit reminiscent of Hades, albeit with a much punkier aesthetic. That said, it's far from the only key difference, so the question remains, did this title have its gameplay on lock, or did it need to rein in some of its ideas? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Starting with ReignBreaker's premise, which, well, you take on the role of Clef, a former knight now working to challenge the monarchy she once served and the Queen of Keys which helms it. A fact which is massively complicated by the existence of the broadcast, a constant insidious influence which leaves the populace susceptible to the Queen's suggestions and all but ensures the status quo goes unchallenged. Nor is the overall scarcity of allies Clef's only hurdle, because while she may have tracked down the bunker, which serves as the broadcast's origin, and potentially the Queen's hiding spot, its engineers clearly binge-watched Cube, given it's a constantly shifting mechanical death trap. And oh, there's also a ragtag assortment of the Queen's most loyal lackeys overseeing the whole mess to boot. Though it does warrant saying that as far as the named minions go, their existence within the narrative winds up being a bit odd, since they strictly exist as characters that Clef will exchange barbs with during the dungeon without ever actually encountering them. Like, okay, maybe I was greedy for wanting to have a boss fight themed around them, but at the same time, their lack of presence extends beyond that point, because while they're certainly posed as a form of opposition to Clef's group, none of them actually influence any of the opposition you'll encounter. No unique traps, enemies, or modifiers. Instead, they are strictly felt through the banter you'll exchange when you open a vault associated with them, and the sort of power-ups you'll earn from them. One of those weird cases of gameplay and story segregation that actually winds up feeling a bit noticeable, if only because of how often you'll be cracking open vaults and looping through the game. That said, the minions aren't your only source of story bit. For instance, there's Clef's campbound ally, who she can confer with between runs or after dying, as well as the rats, children who eke out an existence in the facility. Both of them serve as an avenue for further characterization and bits of lore at large, though the biggest narrative nuggets are found while progressing through a run. Because every so often, Clef and the Queen will trade words over the intercom system, and while the exchange may start out feeling fairly shallow, it isn't too long before they move past taunting and start to drop details that help to frame the story as a whole, and which will then gain further context from the other characters. Though, to sum that all up, overall I found ReignBreaker's story to be fine. There's definitely some interesting concepts at its core, but the execution of them never really hooked me, and more often than not, I was left feeling like they could have been more fleshed out, especially by the time I'd reached its conclusion. So yeah, on the whole, it's a serviceable story with an adequate delivery and ending. Still, ReignBreakers is more than its narrative elements, so let's sink our teeth into the system side of things, and I gotta say, it's definitely easy to pick up and play. Kit-wise, Clef has a few tools at her disposal, but the bread and butter of your offensive options is her basic attack string. A set of quick punches which pairs quite neatly with the mobility provided by her dodge. Mostly because her other tool, the javelin, has a rather unfortunate quirk. While it does let her pick off enemies at a distance by throwing it, and also enables a charged AoE smash, every action taken with it builds heat, and if it overheats, it renders it all but useless, which is less than ideal and saw me mostly reliant on fisticuffs. Mind you, I say mostly here less because of a judicious case of heat management, and more because the ground smash has a secondary function which isn't hindered by overheating. Specifically, its ability to open and trigger the various hazard panels scattered about, because as much as the Queen's domain is absolutely replete with spike traps, acid pools, and other bits of nastiness, they are just as effective against enemies as they are against you. More so, even, if you get clever with the perks you snag. So yeah, as far as a basic loadout goes, you're provided with a decent amount of options to play around with. It's just, you really shouldn't harbor any expectations about it evolving any further. Your basic combo, for instance, doesn't see any significant change to its default state beyond a modular meta upgrade, which modifies it so you can get your JoJo on for a few moments of, And yes, I will acknowledge that there is an outright armory's worth of javelins to collect over the course of the game, but in practice, this number winds up feeling a bit deceptive, given that there's only 5 different types. See, the bulk of the javelins you snag are basically just side grades, whose defining features can be summed up as whether or not the launched javelin has a delay built into it, or can be turned into a proximity mine, and whether it applies an additional effect on hit, like a slow, dot, or lifesteal. Like, don't get me wrong here, you will notice the difference between the 5 types of javelin, since they change up how this slam and throw functions, and a certain meta upgrade even grants them a unique heavy hit while it's equipped. That said, those differences weren't really enough to alter my overarching playstyle in a meaningful manner. In fact, the only reason I settled on the lance that I did at the end of the day was due to its side grade option, since it applied slow on hit, which paired really neatly with the field the railgun lance creates with its slam. Which, yes, that slow also applies to bosses, though I'll never complain about the convenience of a hard-hitting, over-piercing ranged option. But yeah, as far as things go, it's definitely a functional kit, but if you're looking for a lot of variants to set your runs apart, well, it's more or less centered around the perks you'll be picking up over the course of your run. So, like I said earlier, the basic premise is Clef's diving headlong into this facility to beat down the Queen. Now, in order to do so, she has to navigate a series of expansive antechambers, which are loaded with traps, some wandering enemies for good measures, and a series of vaults that can be plundered. Or rather, that need to be plundered, since you can't actually move on to the next area until you hit a vandalism quota by cracking enough open. Which you'd think would be an easy enough choice to make, given that each one lets you choose between a set of perks associated with a member of the Monarch's menagerie of minions. You know, those guys that exist narratively but don't actually oppose you in any way. Obviously, stacking these up makes your run easier, and in a certain sense, it would normally behoove you to snag as many as possible. That said, the game provides a potential wrinkle to this plan by incorporating a clock in certain antechambers, a part-time of sorts that you need to clear if you want to unlock a new javelin in the ensuing recovery room. While you only need to clear it for a given chamber once in order to earn that reward permanently, going through the first time can be pretty stressful since you don't get to know how much or how little time you have to rampage. So, until that javelin is cleared and the timer becomes a non-issue, you'll find yourself needing to deal with an extra layer of strategy in which choice of vaults you'll even risk getting. And I don't just say this because of the rigors of trying to click a haphazard build together on a timer. No, there's also the nature of the vault challenges in and of themselves, because while most of them are going to be as simple as beat down each enemy wave that spawns, there's also a pair of alternate challenges, one of which tasks you with clearing all enemies in 30 seconds, and another that asks you to avoid getting hit at all. And when you have an overarching tight 3-minute time limit to clear the necessary amount of vaults, that adds a lot of pressure and can lead to a fair amount of unnecessary damage being taken, even when taking into account the ability to just dodge past and ignore enemies that aren't relevant to a vault encounter. Especially since Clef is fairly fragile by default, and healing can feel fairly sparse at times, with your only guarantee being the recovery/shop rooms between areas. Here's the thing though, while this certainly sounds like a functional formula for a roguelite, there's 2 immediate flaws that can be picked out. For one thing, as interesting as this timed element is for the tactical nuance it provides a run, it is a finite challenge element. Again, once the spear is collected, the timer associated with a room vanishes, and while deeper vault deaths do provide new antechambers to challenge, eventually those too will be cleared, removing that element from the gameplay loop in its entirety. They don't replenish. There simply isn't a timer or a reason to challenge one once you've collected all the spears. That said, the second issue is perhaps the more pressing of the pair, since ReignBreaker struggles with providing wiggle room for more expansive builds early on, since the overall length of your runs will be on the shorter side. Basically, you're only provided a handful of rooms to clear out before things will cap off at a boss fight, and then end. It honestly feels a bit abrupt and makes the early game feel a bit anticlimactic for the first 2 chapters. Like, that's not to say the boss fights don't have meat to them. I legitimately did enjoy figuring out their quirks and overcoming them, but, well, if you're a fan of variants, it does need to be said that the bosses and their arrangements are fixed for each chapter of the game. A quirk that makes the 3rd run onwards funny, since the first boss room is just the prior 2 combined from then onwards. Waste not, want not, I suppose. Which is doubtlessly the design philosophy behind the next boss, since your 2 encounters with it are largely differentiated by it getting a new phase and health bar. A trend that repeats itself for the final boss in the 2 runs it reigns over. Though, on the subject of design philosophy, I have another grievance. And that's specifically surrounding the elite enemies. See, as you progress through runs, the game starts to increase the security level and thus add enemies who are empowered by specific buffs, such as being able to heal when hitting you, or powering up if you don't kill them fast enough, which can suck when applied to enemies already scattered throughout the stage, since they become incredibly tanky. That said, the most obnoxious kinds are shielded and electrified elites, because both of them effectively serve to turn half of your arsenal into dead weight. Shielded is a simple enough modifier, making them immune to the ranged javelin attacks, though not my precious slow fields. But the electrified modifier? It is annoying, since not only does it cause you to take damage whenever you hit them with a melee attack, it also staggers you. And yes, these effects are permanently on, which becomes an absolutely abysmal development when you reach the later runs and realize that bosses will begin to acquire these modifiers. Yeah, anytime a boss gets shielded or electrified, it is cancer, no 2 ways about it. Especially when one has, say, an entire phase that largely shuts down range attacks for a good portion of the time. Frankly, I'm at a loss for why they thought this was a good idea. Like, a boss having Drain is likewise a tremendous nuisance, since they can heal back huge swaths of health, but at least I have access to the entirety of my toolkit. And it wasn't like they lacked awareness that you can just make a boss fight more interesting by expanding their overall skill set or modifying a bit, since the post-Chapter 6 victory lap I did has some nasty alterations to the bosses that I encountered, and also some variants in which bosses I even encountered in the first room. Like, yeah, that first boss fight, it wasn't the duo for once. It just, took me beating the game for some degree of randomness to occur. But, I digress, because there is still one last system to address, namely the almost requisite roguelite meta progression system. In this case, it's called Resolve, and can be used to gradually purchase upgrades at the skill tree in town. Though, whether those purchases will help Clef out is another matter entirely, due to both the modular nature of the skill tree and the extremely limited amount of slots you'll initially have to play around with. And I'll admit, because I had this compulsive need to fill out the tree to unlock the skills I was interested in exploring, that basically meant one of my slots was permanently occupied by the passive which boosted Resolve gain. I mean, you do get an additional one each time you clear a run, but that does mean it'll take quite some time until you have enough slots to make a cohesive setup that will really serve to exemplify a given playstyle. I was a brawler, which is part of why I feel Electrified has earned itself a special place in hell. I do think, though, that it did miss the mark with this, because again, it makes your earlier run-throughs feel incomplete. It actively frustrated me when I'd built up a slew of decent options that I'd even managed to upgrade, only to find myself limited to 3 of them. 2 in practice because of Resolve. But yeah, that's basically everything that comes to mind insofar as the gameplay, which means it's time to talk about the visuals, and I'll admit here, this is part of what initially caught my attention. ReignBreaker has a neat punky look to it, altogether fitting really for a game about toppling a despotic empire. But yeah, it's pretty good on this front. Also, there was a set of characters who were very much Landsnecht coded, which I always love to see. The enemies and the bosses themselves aren't bad either. I quite enjoyed the animations, and they generally do a decent job of providing tells I could react to. I just wish there'd been more variety. As for the music, well, it does feel very on brand for the aesthetic in general. On the whole, I found it to be decent from start to finish, and that's largely what I have to say on the matter, though I did find myself idling on the opening menu to listen to the starting theme a few times. With all that said, though, it's about time I sum up what my feelings are about ReignBreaker, and ultimately I do have to say that they're a bit mixed. For instance, while there's certainly some interesting concepts introduced in the narrative, ReignBreaker isn't all that concerned with fleshing them out, or the bulk of its characters. Like, yes, there's a small roster of minions, but your interactions with them are largely shallow for all save the Spear Sister. They have banter, yes, but neither the Anarchs, the Doctor, or the Hunter really add or detract from the story by dint of their existence, which is a bit disheartening in a game which has such a small cast. Like, don't get me wrong, it's not a bad story, it just didn't hook me. And as for the gameplay, well, while Clef's arsenal doesn't change up all that much, I had a lot of fun learning how to properly make use of it, whether it was figuring efficiently stacking vault perks and meta upgrades, fooling around with new javelins, or even making optimal use out of the facility traps to end fights faster. All of which I had to make full use of if I was going to beat the clock for the vault timers. Honestly though, I really do wish it would have let me know the par times before I got to the breather room. That said, I'll admit that the experience started to lose a bit of its luster the further I progressed. There just isn't all that much variety insofar as the opposition you'll be facing off against, and while the bosses were neat, the fact that you're fed them incrementally over the course of the various vault loops left me sick to death of the early ones. And no, I really don't consider it's the same boss you fought before, but now they're immune to half your kit as a good time. Ultimately, I really wanted more to do, to engage with, and just things to learn. There really isn't all that much insofar as major innovations as you loop forward, and while the new javelins add a bit to play with, it really wasn't enough to stop my runs from becoming increasingly similar. So yeah, initially ReignBreaker felt like a solid hit, but as time went on and I started to wade my way through the late game loops, I found myself feeling like it had become a fumble. And that really is saying something, because I adore games that exist in this genre. Hades is a fucking masterpiece in my book. I wish that this had managed to capture even a fraction of that magic. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel like that good bean Andy noted. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.